Okay. Uh, we used the S&P 500, and after about its 12th year, it became apparent that while had a high correlation with the total stock market, probably 98% or something like that, still those large cap stocks in the S&P 500 accounted for about 85% of the market.
Sure.
And that left 15% in mid cap and small cap, roughly 10 in mid cap and 5 in small cap. So why not convert the fund into a total stock market index fund? It struck me that was a great theoretical idea and a terrible idea for our shareholders in the marketplace. So we started the Extended Market Index Fund, which picked up that last little bit. And then by 1993, since it was called a completion fund. If you wanted the total market, we could give it to you by having you own those two series. But by 1993, it just seemed silly to keep doing it that way, although we still do it that way today, but we had a total stock market index. Not to my surprise at all, total stock market index is now larger than the 500. It's probably today about 325 billion compared to 305 billion, something like that.
And the total stock market, is it U.S. or is it?
U.S.
Okay.
Now, there is this modern thinking that the total world market should be the way you invest. I'm not so sure about that. I'm always a contrarian. I'm always from Missouri. My thought process is two lines of thought. One, we earn our money in dollars. We save our money in dollars. We spend our money in dollars, and we invest in our money in dollars. Why wouldn't you want to stick with dollars as your only medium of investment? You don't have to worry about currency and all that kind of thing. The second level is, if you look at the U.S. corporate world, 50% of its revenues and 50% of its profits, earnings, come from outside the U.S. So you already own an international fund. And then someone says, well, they fluctuate differently, to which I would say, so what? That's not a good reason for doing it at all, unless you can define standard deviation and you care about the difference between a 15% standard deviation and a 14% standard deviation. And I'll accept that it can matter under certain theoretical circumstances, but I defy the average investor even to tell me what standard deviation is. It's a term of art. We own the business, know it, and it's useful in its own way. And there's certainly a big difference between a standard deviation of, say, 11 or 10 or 11 or 12% in a balanced fund, which fluctuates less, and an all-equity fund, which may have a standard deviation of around 16 or 17%. Variation in returns from one period to the next. And so I don't see that as useful. And I don't see the so-called efficient market as useful. You draw this little high horizon. And the reason I don't, and I wrote a little bit about this, quite a bit about it in my book, Common Sense on Mutual Funds, and that is that every time you take the efficient market line, showing you how much in U.S. and how much in international, it's up here sometimes, it's down here sometimes, inverted sometimes. Which efficient market are you going to buy? Well, you say, of course you'd buy the most recent, and that's probably the worst choice because that's what's been happening. And if you believe in reversion to the mean, which I do profoundly, it's all going to change. So my position on international really is, by the way, almost nobody agrees with me on this. So your students are going to have to make their own judgment. But to me, you can do it fine with U.S. only. You're much more, but if you want to do international, the likelihood it will hurt you a lot is very small. But nonetheless, given the fact that dollars and the euro and the yen and so on, renminbi, are different currencies, I don't see any problem with all U.S. And I would guess that might even do a little better, although I don't know that. And but if you feel the great urge to be with the modern trend, put up to 20% of your equities in international. Right now the U.S. is about 45% of the world, and international, this market capitalization, is about 55% of the world. I just think an American investor, a U.S. investor, doesn't need to have over half of his equity capital outside the U.S. And everybody says you're wrong, you're wrong, you're wrong. But I'm sorry to tell you that my attitude is usually, if one more person tells me I'm wrong, I'll know I'm right. Now, that's not necessarily constructive or wise, but I think that those that look at the story of this company would say it's been right more than it's been wrong.
Fair enough. So it begs the next question, which is there's all sorts of now, quote, intelligent indices out there, right, that take advantage of theory.
Smart beta.
All of that, exactly. So what are your, I mean, you probably have answered the question. If you don't think internationally makes a heck of a lot of sense, then all the rest of these things probably don't either. But what are your thoughts? I mean, historically, value has probably done better than average of the market, and lower beta. So there's all sorts of very good data looking backwards. They kind of indicate that this would be a better way to index. But what are your thoughts?
Well, a couple of thoughts on that, which you're quite correct. I have some thoughts on it. One, the idea of something like smart beta is, I choose my words carefully here, baloney. The rest of the market cannot all be smart beta. Smart beta and dumb beta have to offset one another. Otherwise, everybody is above average.
Right.
And again, we don't have Lake Wobegon on here where all the students are above average. So
except for my students.
I ask people, what is the intellectual basis for indexing? Gross return minus cost equals net return. So if you can capture the market return at minimal cost, you will win. What, I then ask, is the intellectual basis for active management? The only response I've ever gotten to that is, I can do better. Well, that's not an intellectual response. You get 100 managers, probably 100 of them tell you they can do better, and they're not going to sell very much if you say, our big thing here in this firm is we can do worse. It's a big marketing thing, and it cannot be true.
And your point here is, quote, smart beta is effectively a form of active management.
Yeah, sure. And picking your own index
Right.
is the same thing. And I understand the fundamental index thing. I fully understand that if you look at the crisp University of Chicago data, that over going back to 1926 or thereabouts, that value has done better than growth, and that small cap has done better than large cap. But when you look at that on a cumulative return basis, you can find periods, this is point one really on this, you can find periods as long as 20 years when the reverse is true. So history doesn't tell you everything. The past is not necessarily prologue, and often the past is anti-prologue. So that's point number one. Point number two, which is related to that, is let's assume that everybody figures out what you've just told me. Growth, you invest everything in value and small cap, or maybe a combination of both. If a substantial portion of the market does that, those stocks will be bid up, and growth stocks and large stocks will be bid down, and it will all be arbitraged away, because the stock markets are a magnificent arbitrage medium between the past and the future. So what's existed in the past doesn't impress me all that much. Point three is we have actually done this same kind of analysis about growth versus value by looking at the mutual fund industry all the way back to 1933. I think it was 33. And back in those years, there were about 3 firms that had a clearly distinct difference between the two: growth fund and a value fund, or an income fund, they would call it, or equity income fund. And that doesn't show what the University of Chicago CRISP data shows. It shows they're about even. And so you have to ask yourself, is the test this kind of theoretical index whose construction could be challenged at almost every level? Any construction can be.
Sure.
I don't think it has any more weaknesses than any others. And I'm not sure anybody fully understands how it's constructed and what happens to stock that goes out of business and all those things. I mean, I'm sure they try and deal with it, and I'm sure they try and deal with it accurately and honestly and with integrity. But that doesn't mean that it's right, that it gives you the right answer. And it's, to some degree at least, belied by the actual returns of growth versus value in the fund industry. So it then becomes the question which data are more value, or more valuable, or more valid. Thank you. And so just be cautious. I'd say if you feel this way, and this is the way I feel about asset allocation.
That's going to be my next question. So let's talk about asset allocation.
Lean,
Mm-hmm.
lean. No more than that, and don't lean if you don't have to. But that is to say, if you like stocks better than, if you're let's say central equity ratio, and we seem to come down to for most investors, an idea that something like 65% stocks, 35% bonds is an intelligent allocation. Now, we know stocks are almost certain to do better in the long run, just because of the nature of the capital markets. So we've already said we want to do something to give us a little, anchor to windward,
Right.
dry powder, call it what you will, to protect you against behavioral mistakes.
Yep.
And to give you some stability in your account, and usually more income, although not much more today. So if it's 65-35, and for whatever sound reason, not emotional reason, you can come up with, and the market looks substantially overvalued, don't worry about it if you think it's 20% overvalued or 25% or undervalued by the same amount. But if it seems to get out of line by a substantial amount, take the 65 to 50. Take the 35 to 50 and be 50-50. But the idea of an all or nothing approach, well, I sold all my stocks yesterday, you're going to have a long, hard investment lifetime.
Right.
Who can do that?
Right.
And we still know people that left a lot of mutual funds. We did not have much of a problem here because of our index base, but who left the market after it went down 50% in 2007 to 2009, February or March of 2009, and they got out and they haven't gotten back yet.
Well, I mean, the mutual fund flow data is enormously powerful.
Yeah.
Right. Everybody's flooded into bonds and out of equities, and we've had a fabulous equity market.
Yeah, I mean, it's unbelievable the strength of the equity market. But I don't see it quite yet being substantially overvalued enough to make a change. But
so
again,
what would you do in a time frame of the late 90s? So you have stocks at 30 times, plus you've got bonds, investment grade bonds, kind of 7%. And so, there's a case to be made where, no, just kind of pick your asset allocation, pick your index fund, and ride it out. But those do seem to be extremes where logic kind of dictates that you really probably ought to do some adjustment.
I hate to say this because it makes me into a market timer, but of course you're absolutely right. And to make matters worse, if I deny it, I would have to expunge my recorded comments at a Morningstar conference in the spring of 2000 when the market was at its all-time high. And I said to Don Phillips, he did a one-on-one interview. We did 2 sessions, and the combined attendance in the 2 sessions was more than the attendance at the meeting. I can't understand why anybody would have wanted to hear that twice. But I said at one point when he asked me about that, I said, Don, with bonds yielding around 7% today, the stock market yielding 1%, the stock market being at that point closer to 40 times earnings than to 30, I think it's impossible that in the next decade, and I look at things in decade lengths, that stocks will outperform bonds. The returns on stocks ought to be, pretty close to nominal, and the returns on bonds are going to be 7% a year. That's doubling your money in the decade. And then I looked at him and said, Don, sometimes I sit here and worry why I have any money in stocks whatsoever. And I was in the process then, and I can't remember the exact timing, but obviously around that time, of reducing my own equity position from it's normal of about 70-75%. I don't even remember, maybe 80%, down to about 25 or 30%, and I did that.
Mm-hmm.
So, but mainly, well, importantly because of that, everybody says, you knew what was going to happen, and I suppose you could argue that I did, but that I was also, my heart was failing, and my life was endangered. I wanted to make sure what kind of estate I had, mostly my retirement plan here, was protected for my family. So it was a personal financial decision, greatly abetted by the fact that it made totally financial and economic sense.
Sure.
And how many times in a lifetime does that come along? Well, I went through the crash in 72, 74.
Mm-hmm.
That was before the after the merger, and that was not as easy to see coming. Went from a moderately overvalued position to a greatly undervalued position. Stock yields got to 7%
Remarkable.
in '74, and nobody said, "Why don't we buy stocks?"
No.
And with bond yields,
They had to have higher yields than bonds to make them interesting, right?
and then when Paul Volcker comes in, and some of the yields on, say, long-term treasuries, intermediate-term treasuries range around 15%. Nobody thought I ought to get out of stocks and into bonds. It was not so much that stocks were overpriced; it was that bonds were the steal of the century.
Right.
And this last 50% decline, one of I think 4 I've experienced, was they're all different. That's one really important thing. Don't say I've seen all this before. You never, very few times does the same thing happen twice, and in the financial markets, the same problems happen twice.
Repeat, right?
Yeah, each one is its own. There's some statement like, all happy families are alike, and all unhappy families are different, but all unhappy families are alike in their own way, or something like that.
Yep.
And the problem here is that all these bear markets are very, very different, inspired by different things, sometimes mathematics, sometimes investors' emotions, and sometimes by external factors. And what really happened is we should have seen, any of us, and I didn't see it because I wasn't involved in that, the mortgage market that was developing. Catastrophic. If I'd spent 8 hours with a salesman for Washington Mutual or Countrywide,
Right.
even better, on the West Coast, just going to that salesman to house, here you can borrow $300,000, put $200,000 into a house of which I'll get you a $200,000 mortgage and keep $100,000 for yourself, and you're making $17,000 a year, go ahead and do it.
I'm going to cut you right there. We're losing
And you would have been, if you'd known that, and I think it's arguable that I should have known it, but not many people did. And
We off?
Yeah.
Okay.
We got just that light's
That's fine.
flashing.